along the road. It also became a kind of heroic social bandit in Hindi language during the British colonial period in the early 19th century. Basically, the British described, well into the 20th century, described any mass mobilization of working class or rural people in India as a thuggy revolt, which eventually became a thug revolt. While people like Mahatma Gandhi and more elite protesters in India were called terrorists, because the British Empire would call you a terrorist if you were a political dissident that threatened the state. But if you were a working class or rural or of the popular classes and you were kind of seen as, of the uneducated masses, then you didn't even get the dignity of being called a terrorist, because that implied you had a plot and an ideology and a conspiracy. So if you didn't even have that much stuff going on in your head, you were just called a thug. That's someone who not even bothered to call them a terrorist because they don't actually have, they're not perceived as having an ideology or a plan or a history. They're just a body that's outraged and threatening. So this has a long history dating back to about the year 1800. In Hindi, the word thug goes all the way back to the 1400s. But as a particular British notion for lower class people that were kind of mindless and in revolt, they called them thugs, appropriating the Hindi term for bandit, but then making it a general counterinsurgency term. So, if you ever saw Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you ever seen that? Those people bouncing around and ripping each other's hearts out are called the thuggy cult, the thug cults in that movie. So they're taking that old term. That's where that classic movie of prejudice against Indians takes the word thug. So in Egypt during the 1800s was part of the British Empire, and it also was a key nexus for counterinsurgency in India. Supply routes, one of the reasons why they built the Suez Canal was to keep the supply routes for the counterinsurgency. The repression of revolts in India kept Britain involved. So the word Baltagi in Egyptian Arabic actually doesn't directly come from Hindi thug. It comes from the Turkish word for baltachi, which is someone that carries those big, like in medieval times, those like big halberds, those like axes with the two heads. That was like a Turkish high elite soldier, was a baltaji. But in my research, around the 1800s, the word baltaji, which was an honorable protector soldier in Turkish, because of the use of the word thuggy, al-thuggy in Arabic, al-thuggy, becomes, for the Hindi word, becomes mixed with baltagi. And so the word baltagi doesn't become the medieval guard, it becomes the thug that's resisting in the streets, the enforcer, the protection racket. So we have in Egypt this term baltagi, which I argue is part of this racialized term for thug, coming from Hindi through the British Empire, which goes all the way to the Revolution 2011, which called Mubarak Baltagi, and then Mubarak called the protesters Baltageya, and it became the thug war versus the thug revolution. And then we moved to the United States. But that term had also circulated in Jamaica in the early 1800s. The slave revolts that often claimed independence for a few months in Jamaica were crushed by the British, by the same people trained in repressing the thug revolts in India. So here we have the transfer of the word thug into the American struggles of chattel slaves against their masters. And remember the horrible assassination in the church in Charleston last year. That same church was where the Charleston slave revolt was organized in 1822. In that same church, which then led to a massacre and a banning of Christianity amongst black South Carolinian freed slaves for a while. That same church where that massacre happened was where the slave revolt had been launched, and which it was called by the, of course they weren't British, they're American, but they'd been influenced by this counterinsurgency tradition. It was called the Thug Revolt in South Carolina. So this term thug circulates this long history of talking about people who are rising up, particularly against policing, in the Indian context, in the Egyptian context, in the black diaspora tradition, but these are all connected by this word thug. A thug is specifically a kind of uprising that's seen as not having a kind of consciousness. It's disrespected, it's seen as too physical, it's seen as out of control. But this has a long, long, long history. But it circulates within the British Empire system and within the Arab and Turkish spheres to some extent. It only, for example, Rio de Janeiro, which is part of the Portuguese Empire, didn't have the word thug. They have plenty of other racist terms for this, but they started to use the word thug in Portuguese in 2014. And people have been sending me articles to review using the word thug because it's part of this now, like the word terrorist, it's now a global term that people associate with protests against police. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up a bit. So how many people saw Sarah Palin, right, last week, whenever this was? And she was supposed to be at the bedside of her husband who just got total wipeout on his snowmobile. But she was campaigning for Trump and gave a speech which just, of course, jumped out of the history books in all the wrong ways. So she was talking about the protests in Chicago, which are against Rahm Emanuel, against police exterminations and brutality, racial brutality in Chicago, as well as against Trump's discourse. And she called the protesters petty punk-ass little thuggery. So that's about as many different racial, homophobic, gender, dismissive, class, and race slang terms that you can possibly put together. Petty, so that means they're kind of stupid and small, selfish grievances. Also petty implies somewhat feminized and weak. Punk-ass, of course, is her use of prison slang for whatever kind of homo something or other. Little thuggery, and of course thuggery being this very historic term for a particular kind of slave revolt or popular revolt that's dismissed. So when you read Sarah Palin's beautiful full discourse here, what we don't have time, I'm not going to try to do Sarah Palin's voice. What we don't have time for is all that petty, punk-ass little thuggery stuff that's been going on with those quote-unquote protesters who are doing nothing but wasting your time and trying to take away your, who is you, First Amendment rights, your rights to assemble peacefully, and the media being on the thug side. What the heck are you guys thinking, media? It doesn't make sense. Well, you all get it, talking to her Trump people. I think the media and too many other candidates are underestimating the wisdom of the people. Not being the punk-ass thuggery, but the other people. You're smart, energized, optimistic, positive, and that's why you're here today, and I thank you for spending your time here today, because it is time. We have all recognized, the majority of Americans have recognized, Republicans, independents, good old blue dog Reagan Democrats out there. Blue dog, I have to go to that one. We have all recognized we need a revolution. It is time to get rid of the status quo. The status quo has got to go, right? We have needed a revolution, and we found a revolutionary. Donald Trump is that revolutionary. So I think that Sarah Palin, once again, unintentionally has channeled the moment in the most amazingly vernacular way. She vibrates with kind of gender and race language about them meaning us, the protesters and politically conscious people, and then you, the Trump people who are positive, smart, energized, optimistic. You see all these the head terms versus the racialized body terms and queer terms, right? But then this is about the people and a revolution. And a revolution led by a right-wing populist that explicitly quotes Mussolini and others. So we're at a very particular moment in which we have these changes coming together. Actually, I'm strangely kind of optimistic because there's something about the way that response movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's the Bernie Sanders movement or whether it's new forms of protest movement around politics, have revealed very explicitly, it doesn't take me talking about it to reveal the race and the class history in these discourses. But I think what we need to pay attention to in our academic spheres and in our political spheres is taking the police very seriously in their context and making sure we don't drop that ball or miss that thread, and that we're not just talking about the presidents on top or the communities. We need to look at those movements in the middle. So what we've done here is focused on police self-identifications. We've focused on resistance logics of the police themselves, turning inside out human rights and victims' rights, adopting new missionary and militia ideologies. And we focused on the way, I know Gillian Schwedler and others will talk about this more tomorrow, but the way that spaces of the popular, streets, squares, stadiums, have been taken over by these new forms of right-wing populisms. We think of a stadium now, we think of Trump stadiums. We think instead of protests in the squares, right? We've had this shift. And the way that the new popular is being identified with thug revolts. This new populism sees either these gleaming figures that are fully devoted to Blue Lives Matter and to Trump, or else these horribly monstrous figures that are the other protesters, that are us, that are thinking of a different kind of notion of popular sovereignty and revolution. So I hope that this is somewhat helpful, and this helps us think differently about peace, and about uprising, and about Ferguson and the tradition of police struggles in the United States. So thank you very much for your attention. Sure. You want to come up here to... Yeah, does anybody have any questions? Yeah, please.
I wanted to raise some questions about the use of the word populism. Not to be argumentative, but to kind of really express some uncertainty. You may have seen a piece of the Wall Street Journal that was about Latin American Trump reminding Latin American intellectuals and politicians about Latin American populism.
Right.
Most of the people quoted in Latin America were center-right intellectuals, railing against Perón and Vargas and Chavez and saying Trump is like them. And so that's the kind of demonization of populists. And
right.
In a sense, that's kind of the direction you've been pointing in, populism as as bad.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of revisionist history by really great historians about Perón that are trying to hold that differently, recognize the anti-democratic aspects of Perón, recognize the long-term negative consequences, but really point out how deeply Juan and Eva Perón represented, gave voice to, recognized the dignity of, welcomed into public spaces. So when I engaged with people about the Wall Street Journal article, I said, wait a minute, if I think that's what Latin American populism is, either I have to say Trump is something different, or I have to open up my thinking in a way I don't want to about who Trump is recognizing or letting in. Yeah. So, and then when you show the pictures of the police, the blue demonstrations, the Igreja Universal, I'm wondering how we want to use the word populist and
right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Populism isn't a political set of political practices that aligns clearly with left or right, right? But in a sense, it speaks for the people in the name of the people, while not necessarily providing a space for popular agency. So, but I would never, I'm very much involved in day-to-day details of the current struggles in Brazil, where Lula, by far the most populist, in any sense of the word, figure in the last since Vargas, of course, is in a very perilous position. I wouldn't want to throw him out with the bathwater of populism. And and Perón, of course, and Peronist legacies in Argentina is extremely complicated. There's definitely been very bad Perón moments, and there's been better Perón moments. But I think you're right. I think looking at populism, not overgeneralizing, and I'm focusing on authoritarian populism, which this language all comes out of Latin American studies for me. So I'm particularly focusing on authoritarian populism, which is different from socialist, clientelist, rentier state populisms or whatever. But yeah, you're right. I need to underline the differences. But as someone who's been following protests and new forms of Occupy and new forms of thinking about the state and participation, I do think populism is essentially problematic, not essentially right-wing, but essentially problematic because it speaks in the name of the people while usually, at best, using the mobilization as a kind of tool rather than as a redistributed mechanism. So, but I think certainly at this moment we don't want to just put everyone who's got some charisma and some following into the same basket because we have some very important progressive populists. And of course that's why it's so interesting that we have Bernie and we have Trump at the same time. We're two populists of very, very, very different stripes. And Bernie maybe isn't a populist. If his movement survives the election, then he's not a populist. He's actually a popular organizer, which is different from a populist that pulls the carpet underneath the people as it speaks to the people. Yeah.
Okay. Two questions. I didn't want to make a comment and then I have a question. But the comment is, I don't think populism, I have no idea what it means, but in Europe it's used to refer to the right-wing neo-fascist groups. And in Latin America it's been used to refer to leftist groups. And so we're just throwing this term around, but it's meaning something different. And somebody wrote a great article about why Bernie Sanders is not a populist, he's a socialist, which is different.
Yeah,
okay.
It's different.
About the police, about, I want to push you on whether police can be or are ever autonomous. Because I think they're never autonomous. And I think they're never autonomous because they are dependent on funding, they are dependent on not being prosecuted, and they're dependent on, it doesn't have to be the president, but it can be the leaders in Congress, together with particular political elites that use the police as a kind of battering ram and a kind of insurgency. But the police are always aligning themselves with at least one current within the state and within the political elite. They are never independent.
Well, I would say, of course I'm going to say, well, it's relative autonomy instead of autonomy. But I think that many of those same limiting or conditioning factors you talked about, the fact that they can be, the judicial system can hold them accountable. They have to have funding from somebody. They have to have a mission that's legitimized by some part of the state. So I agree with that, but we all know, of course, like anyone in the polity also has to meet those three conditions, right? I think we've assumed that the police somehow are much more organically dependent on the law and the judicial system and state funding, when I think, as we know, the privatization of policing, the way they get contracts and funds, their entrepreneurial roles, whether it's in the crack wars in New York or LAPD, which is still completely all over the place in terms of how it relates to informal economies and billionaire economies and real estate economies and drug economies and El Salvadoran Civil War economies. And, all those factors can spin things in a different way. And of course you could say that police are actually sometimes the least likely to have to actually follow judicial oversight, in a sense. In some context. But no, I agree in a sense that we can't just